let's talk about type 2 authentication. Type 2 authentication is something you have. You remember we said that type 1 authentication is something you know, and type 1 authentication is the weakest form of authentication. You remember the things we said about password vulnerabilities and how passwords are vulnerable to brute force attacks. So let's talk about type 2 authentication, which is something you have. So this is a method of verifying a user's identity by requiring them to provide a physical item they possess, such as a device or a token. For example, you can go to the bank and get a hardware token to authenticate transactions on your bank account. So this is where type 2 authentication comes in. And the benefit of this approach is that it has an extra layer of security beyond just a password. So after you have provided your password, they might say, okay, go generate a token, whether it could be a software token too. And an example is the Google Authenticator, which generates a token for you to get access to accounts. So even if someone knows your password, they still need the hardware token or your software token, to complete the authentication process. One-time password are unique single-use password generated for each login attempt. So one-time password is only valid once, ensuring that even if someone intercepts it, they can only use it once. There are so many accounts that utilize one-time password. I think banks, they use it a lot. There's sometimes you want to do a transaction and they say, oh, we sent you an OTP to authenticate this transaction. And that OTP, once you use it once, you cannot use it again. Also, there's the time-based OTPs. There are some OTPs that they say, oh, you can only use it for 15 minutes or you can only use it for 10 minutes. I see that a lot with my internet service provider. Hardware token is it's something physical. You can hold it. The hardware token, they are quite secure because they are less susceptible to malware attacks due to their physical nature. On the other hand, we have software tokens, and these you can use applications like the Google Authenticator. They perform the same function as the hardware token and they generate unique codes for each login attempt. The advantage there is convenience. So you don't need, for example, for the hardware token, you need to carry it around with you. Let's say you want to do a transaction and you're not at home where the hardware token is, that can be a challenge. But with the software token, you don't need an additional device beyond your smartphone, which you already have with you where you are. So let's look at some examples of type 2 authentication. We have biometric passport, which contains your personal information and a digital photo. It's something you have and it can be used alongside other factors like a PIN to verify your identity. Credit card is another everyday example. You carry a physical card, that contains your data necessary for transactions. So when paired with a PIN, this forms a two-factor authentication. Many of us have credit cards that we slot into a point of sale machine or the bank ATM. The third picture is an hardware token that generates a one-time password that you can use along with your regular password to log into your account securely. So multi-factor authentication combines two or more types of authentication. So we can combine something with something you have. So we've talked about time-based password and the one-time password, the security of type 2 authentication, which is stronger than the traditional password-based authentication. We looked at some examples. We looked at physical tokens. We looked at digital tokens. Finally, let's talk about type 3 authentication. Type 3 authentication is something you are. So this is a form of authentication that relies on a unique physical or behavioral characteristics to verify your identity. For example, physical traits like your fingerprint or your facial features. And this is unique for each person and it's difficult to replicate. So your fingerprint is unique to you because our fingerprints are not the same. Even for twins, their fingerprints are not the same. And this is why the type 3 authentication is the most secure form of authentication. So if a question comes up in the exam asking which of the following is the most secure form of authentication, it is type 3 because of these things that we have talked about. Another aspect is behavioral traits such as the way you type, the way you walk, all those things are kind of unique to us. The only downside with the type 3 authentication is the cost. It is the most secure form of authentication and is also the most expensive form of authentication. Physical biometrics, and this is the type of biometrics that uses unique psychological traits like your fingerprint, your iris pattern, or facial features. And think about your fingerprint; it does not change over time, and makes it that's why it makes it a reliable way to confirm your identity. Also, behavioral biometrics is another thing to look at, and this is where they can use something like how you type, your voice, and how you walk. But then, with every good thing, there's always, a downside, and one of the downside is false accept, false reject, and the complexity of the user experience, and also cost. Now let's dig into it one after the other. For the first accept, this is where unauthorized users are granted access. Sometimes for your smartphone, your younger sister can unlock your phone with her face. So that's one of the challenges we have with the biometric authentication. There's that issue with false accept, and there's also false reject, which occurs when an authorized user is denied access, which is leading to frustration. Maybe you've registered for an exam, and on the exam day you put your fingerprint and it's just rejecting you, and they say, oh, go wash your hand, go clean your fingers with some sanitizer, and you come back and you still put your fingerprint and it's still not working. And I mean, that can be quite frustrating. Also, the complexity of implementing this method also poses, some challenge, as it requires sophisticated technology and infrastructure. There are also privacy concerns with biometrics, because biometric can reveal a lot about an individual, and this leads to several privacy concerns. For instance, sensitive information can be inferred from biometric data like retina scans. Recent study has shown that is a possibility. You can know that somebody has this type of disease just by looking at their retina scan, and that raises issues of confidentiality. Another concern is that biometrics serves as unique identifiers, like password, which can be changed over time. Your biometric data is permanent, and so if it's compromised, that poses a severe risk. That means for life, that person has your data. That person has that unique identifier that uniquely defines you. Another concern is unauthorized access to this data could result in significant privacy breaches and misuse. Biometrics also come with some security risk, and the most concerning is the risk of permanent compromise. If your fingerprint data is stolen, you can't change it like your password. It's difficult to reuse it once they are compromised, because the fingerprint is unique to you. Your biometric data is exposed or is stolen, you can't change it easily. I mean, you can't scrape off your fingerprint, right? So also with technology and phones that takes sharp pictures these days, somebody can spoof that image for facial recognition. Lastly, with the inability to change these traits, make them a unique security challenge compared to additional methods like you can change your password, but you can't change your fingerprint. So that's a major challenge to look out for there. Now, also, you can also combine type 3 authentication with other forms of authentication. So you can combine type 1 authentication, which is password, something you know, with something you have and something you have. Just to provide that extra layer of security, know that multi-factor authentication is two forms of authentication. Multi-factor authentication is not the same. So when we talk about multi-factor authentication, we are not talking about two forms of password. It has to be two different forms of authentication. It has to be type 1, either type 1 authentication or type 2 authentication, or type 2 authentication plus type 3 authentication. So you cannot have, so if the question is saying the person used their password and they also use their PIN, that is not multi-factor authentication, because both password and PIN are something you know. So for you to have multi-factor authentication, you have to combine two different types of authentication. We talked about type 3 authentication, which is the most secure form of authentication, also the most expensive. And we also talked about issues like false accept, where your phone, accepts somebody that looks like you, or even sometimes it might not even somebody like looks like you. It's just an issue with the algorithm. Also false rejects, where it rejects you, for some reason you're trying your biometric and it's just rejecting you. Also the irreplaceable biometric data, once it's stolen, it cannot be replaced. I mean, that's a lifetime issue. Also privacy concerns, physical and behavioral biometrics, which is also some things to to look out for. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and see you in the next one. Bye.